The second caliph of the righteous caliphs, Al-Khulafa al-Rashidun, is perhaps the most renowned. His name is Omar, or Unar, and he reigns for about 10 years, from 634 to 644. Omar was a convert who actually despised Islam at the beginning. He did not follow the Prophet immediately, but the early Islamic sources tell us something about the process that led him eventually to become a Muslim. It is said that one day Omar, who heard about that Prophet Muhammad and about his messages, came home, and he heard that his sister decided to follow the Prophet. He was enraged. He was so angry at her, and he said, "How could you do such a thing?" And his sister said, "Don't be angry. Before you judge me, before you decide what to do, I'd like to ask you to read something that the Prophet says." And she handed him over a written prophecy given by the Prophet, by Muhammad. And Omar allegedly read the prophecy and immediately was convinced that Islam is the true religion. Hence, he became a follower of Muhammad. When he was nominated the second Caliph of the Khulafa Rashidun, this is also the beginning of the great era of conquests in Islam. He's actually the real builder. Within 10 years, he changes the world, the Middle East. He is the great builder of the empire of the Muslims. He is reported to be a monotheistic believer, one of the real believers in the monotheistic belief. He is reported to be a Faruq. Faruq in Arabic means a redeemer, in a sense. Now that's a title that tells a lot about the appreciation that people had towards him as a religious leader. Yet, I would like to emphasize, Omar was not considered to be a prophet. We should be careful about that. As I mentioned earlier, none of the followers of Muhammad, by definition, can be a prophet. But he was a devout monotheistic believer, as I said. So he is the builder, as I said, of the Islamic Empire. Within 10 years, he manages to conquer the Sassanid Empire, the Persian Sassanid Empire, which was a pagan empire, and he also manages to conquer huge territories that formerly belonged to the Byzantines. Yet he did not manage to destroy the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Muslims would attempt to destroy the Christian Byzantine Empire for the next hundreds of years, but they will not succeed until the 15th century. Only the Turks, who are a different type of Muslims, yet there are Muslims, the Turks in the 15th century managed to destroy and conquer the Byzantine Empire, or to be more precise, its capital, Constantinople, nowadays Istanbul, in the year 1453. So the Byzantine Empire was damaged, was heavily damaged, yet it still survives, and it will fulfill a major part in the history of the Middle East in the following hundreds of years, also in the Crusader period and later. The territories that were taken by Omar from the Byzantines include the present region of Syria, the present region of Lebanon, the land of Israel, and of course Egypt, which was a rich part of the Byzantine Empire, and Egypt was taken in the year 642 AD. Now, the conquest of the land of Israel is perhaps one of the most important issues to be dealt with. The Muslims tried to take over the land of Israel already in the year 634, but they failed, and then they tried again in 636, and in a famous battle called the Yarmouk battle. The Yarmouk battle took place in the northern part of the land, and the Byzantines were defeated by the Muslims. That actually opened the gates of the Holy Land. But it took the Muslims a couple more years to actually take over the entire country. In 638, the Muslim army conquered Jerusalem. And this is a very interesting story that I'd like to elaborate a little bit on, the story of the conquest of Jerusalem. Firstly, it is said in the Muslim sources that Omar himself commanded the troops of the Muslims in the conquest of Jerusalem. Many scholars doubt whether this was indeed the fact. It is reasonable to assume that he was one of his commanders who did the actual job, and that later, due to the importance of Jerusalem and the Holy Land to the Muslims, the entire story was linked and associated with the leader of the Muslims. But it's not really important whether Omar himself led the Muslim troops or not. It is important to understand that it happened in his time. Yet the story goes that when Omar attacked the city, according to the Muslim sources, the Christians were willing to negotiate a surrender of the city. And indeed, the Muslims decided that it's better also for them to get Jerusalem peacefully instead of losing lives and spending time in a siege. And therefore, a surrender treaty was signed between the Muslims and the Christians. The Christians back then were led by the Patriarch of Jerusalem. His name was Sophronius. Now, it is said that once Omar conquered the city, he entered the gates and was received by Sophronius, the defeated leader of the Byzantines. And the first thing Omar asks from Sophronius is, take me to, and I'll say it in Arabic, to Musalla Dawood. Musalla Dawood means the prayer place of David. From the continuation of the story, we understand that what he meant by that was the place of the temple in Jerusalem, the Jewish temple. Mind you, according to the Bible, David was not the man who actually built the temple. God stopped him, even though he wanted to build the temple. God didn't want that. He said that his hands are covered with blood, and therefore the project will be handed over to his son, Solomon. Indeed, Solomon was the builder. Yet, according to the Bible, David was responsible for the initiative, for the idea. He was responsible for preparing the building materials, and therefore he has a definite link with the idea of the temple. So Omar asks from Sophronius to take him to the place of prayer of David, i.e. the place of the Jewish temple that was indeed later built by King Solomon. And Sophronius agrees, of course, and he takes him to the Holy Sepulchre Church. Now, I can understand that from the Christian point of view. The Holy Sepulchre Church is the replacement for the Jewish temple. The Jewish temple was destroyed. Jews expect for the building of the temple in the future. That would be the third temple. That will happen when the Messiah comes. But according to Christianity, the Messiah has already come. So obviously the third temple is a building that now exists. That's the Holy Sepulchre Church. Indeed, many traditions of the Jewish temple moved from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem to the Golgotha area, to the Holy Sepulchre Church. Traditions about the place being the center of the world, traditions about some links with King Solomon, and Abraham and the burial of Adam and so on. So these traditions that originally related to the Temple Mount moved under the Christian rule to the Holy Sepulchre Church. So from the point of view of Sophronius, I can understand why he takes Omar to that site. However, Omar immediately realizes this is not the place. And of course, the question is, how could he know? It's his first time in Jerusalem. He has never been in the Holy Land. It's been under Byzantine control until now. How did he know? So he explains. Omar explains that when the prophet came to Jerusalem, Muhammad, in the famous night journey, elaborating that a little bit later, when he came to Jerusalem, he then reported to Omar what he saw before he went from the Holy Rock in the Temple Mount to heaven to receive the commandment of prayer. He looked around and then he describes to Omar what he saw. So Omar generally knew what to expect, and obviously the Holy Sepulchre Church was not the site he expected. So he asked of Sophronius to take him to the real place this time. Meanwhile, it's time to pray. Remember, Muslims pray 5 times a day, and now it's time to pray. And Omar asks Sophronius to take him out and allow him to pray outside the church. And Sophronius says, "Why? Why won't you pray inside the church?" Again, I can explain. I can understand why Sophronius suggested to Omar, the conqueror, to pray inside the church. That will show that he actually succumbs to the God of the Christians. In a way, it's a symbolic issue, symbolic political issue. Omar probably realized that, and therefore he refused to actually pray in the church, and he insisted on praying outside. So Sophronius takes him out, he prays, and then he comes back to the church. And then Omar asks Sophronius, "Do you know why I was reluctant to pray inside the church?" And Sophronius says, "No. What was the reason?" And Omar explains that if he prayed inside the church, hundreds of years later, the Muslims would come and claim the church for themselves as being the place of prayer of Omar. So I basically saved your church, says Omar. Indeed, it's interesting to note that we have archaeological evidence that at the original entrance to the Holy Sepulchre Church, not the one that we see today, but the one that was originally to the east of the present-day church, there was indeed a Muslim mosque. We have found an inscription mentioning that mosque. So perhaps there's something to this story which is told in the records of the time. Nevertheless, Omar eventually gets to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and there he approaches the Holy Rock. The Holy Rock, in Arabic, as-sakhra, meaning the rock. In Hebrew, it's called Even Hashtiyah, the foundation stone, on which, according to Jewish tradition, the world was established. The entire creation stands on this stone, and that's where the Jewish temple was built. Omar approaches the holy stone, and he sees that it is covered with garbage, with filth. The explanation to that was that during the Byzantine rule, the Byzantines tried to eliminate the sanctity of the rock and the former location of the temple, showing the demise and fall of the Jewish tradition. Omar orders the site to be cleaned, and now he has to decide where to build a mosque. He is uncertain about that, so he consults with his counselor. His counselor is a former Jew named Ka'b al-Ahbar. And Ka'b, who converted to Islam, is very knowledgeable about Jewish traditions and Jewish history. So Omar consults with him. What would you say, Ka'b? Where should I build my mosque? And Ka'b's advice is to build the mosque to the north of the location of the holy rock. Omar looks at him and he says, "Oh, Kaib, perhaps you're a Muslim, but deep inside, you still remain a Jew." Why did Omar say that? Well, the explanation is quite simple, actually. You see, Muslims have to pray towards Mecca. Mecca is south of the land of Israel. So if one builds a mosque north of the location of the rock, then Muslims praying at this mosque have to pray towards Mecca to the south, but on the way, they also worship the site of the rock. And Omar didn't want that. He did not want Muslims to even be seen as they were worshipping the holy rock, which belonged to the Jewish tradition. So this is quite interesting. You see, it shows us that there's some complexity in the attitude of Islam towards the holy site of Jerusalem. On the one hand, the main reason why Muslims came to Jerusalem is because of its sanctity, not just because of politics. And that idea was adopted by early Muslims from Christianity and Judaism, in which the site of Jerusalem is a holy site. So obviously Jerusalem is holy, but Jerusalem's holiness is an old holiness. It goes back thousands of years. Jerusalem is the older sister of Mecca. Remember, Jerusalem was actually the first direction of prayer in the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So obviously that sets a threat to Mecca, because Mecca is relatively a new site in terms of monotheism. It is only consecrated by any monotheistic religion in the time of Muhammad. In historical terms, it happened 10 minutes ago. So Jerusalem's sanctity may pose a threat in the eyes of Omar, and therefore he decides not to pray towards the holy rock, not to build a mosque north of the rock. Instead, Omar orders to build a mosque to the south of the mosque, meaning that whenever a Muslim prays towards Mecca, he turns his back to the holy site of the Jewish temple. That is, by the way, the case even today, because in the south side of the Temple Mount today, there's another mosque. It's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I'll mention that later. And that mosque is built south of the rock. And indeed, every Muslim, even today, praying in Al-Aqsa Mosque towards Mecca, turns his back to the holy site of the Jewish temple. That's one thing that happens, the building or the sanctification of the Temple Mount in Muslim terms. We'll discuss later why was that done. It is linked with the story of the Isra and Miraj, the night journey of Muhammad, but other stories are also linked with that, so it deserves a discussion, and we'll discuss this in our lesson dedicated to the sanctity of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount in Islam. That will come later in this course. So Omar builds a mosque on the former Jewish Temple Mount, and the last thing that I'd like to mention regarding Omar is quite fascinating. In the time of the occupation, the Muslim occupation of Jerusalem in 638, there were no Jews living in the city. That's quite interesting, because the Byzantines in the time of Sophronius did not allow Jews to live in the city. Now, we know that before that, perhaps in the 4th, 5th centuries, Jews lived in the city. We know where they actually resided. It was to the north of the Temple Mount. Under Christian rule, yes, they still live there. Not too many of them, but maybe not too many of them, but they definitely live there. We have Jewish sources mentioning that. We have Byzantine sources referring to that fact. But by the time of Sophronius, by 638, there were no Jews living in the city. And actually, when Omar signed the treaty with the Christians, they made him promise that he will not allow Jews to come back and live in the Holy City. And he signed that. Yet, immediately after the conquest, Omar realized that he has a problem. He has just taken a religious site, one of the most important in the Christian world, perhaps some would say the most important, a place where which is linked to the birth of Christianity. It is populated with Christians and only Christians. And the question is, how do you control such a location? How do you control such a place without having a population that is related to you, a Muslim population, or at least people who are faithful, who can be trusted to represent the Muslim interests in such a holy site? And he realizes that until the demography of Jerusalem changes, indeed that will take a couple of hundreds of years, until that happens, he has to bring people to the city that he can trust, who would cooperate with the Muslims. And the only plausible option at that point was simply to bring Jews. I know it sounds a bit odd because in the modern Middle East, Judaism and Islam seem to be in constant conflict. But things were different in the 7th century. You see, back then, Jews were persecuted, oppressed by Christianity, by the Byzantine Empire, and therefore the allyship with the Muslims seemed to be the most natural thing to do. Indeed, later, the Islamic world would oppress the Jews too, but at the beginning, things looked a bit more optimistic. And therefore, Omar decides to bring Jewish families to Jerusalem. He consults with the leaders of the Christian community, and he wanted to do that in agreement with them. They realized that they cannot totally object the move, but they tried to reduce the number of the Jews allowed in the city. Eventually, Omar and the Christians agree on a limited number of 70 Jewish families to settle in Jerusalem. These Jewish families were settled in the city, and we have a document, a slightly later document, recording a negotiation between Omar and the Jews. Omar asks the Jews, according to that document, where would they want to settle in Jerusalem? And they ask that they would wish to be living in a place which is close to the temple's gates. Obviously, they did not mean the temple as a building, because that building is no longer there. It's being destroyed by the Romans 700 years ago. They refer to the Temple Mount. So they actually refer to the gates of the Temple Mount on the one hand. We'd like to be close to the Temple Mount. And on the other hand, they say we want to be in a walking distance with the Pool of Siloam. Now, we know where the Pool of Siloam is. It's in the southern side of the city of David. So the location that the Jews actually ask of themselves is known today as the city of David. Unknown to the Jews, they did not realize that because they did not learn history. They did not have the archaeological knowledge that we have today. Unknown to the Jews, they actually chose the location, which is the ancient core of Jerusalem in the time of David and Solomon. That's the site where Jerusalem actually began in Canaanite times before David and Solomon. And this is where Jerusalem in the time of David and Solomon was, to the south of the Temple Mount. So Omar is actually the man who renews the Jewish settlement in Jerusalem in 638.